Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back, everyone, to Civics in a Year. We are continuing our conversation with Dr. Alan Gibson on Federalist 10. If you have not listened to the previous episode, please go ahead and do so first.
Madison, in contrast, is going to be the person who boldly challenges the small republic thesis, okay? First, he doesn't believe that it's possible to have really a very large government or territory at all governed and have a homogeneity of interest. Even the state governments have diversity, a lot of diversity within them. And the state governments, Hamilton's going to say this in Federalist number 9, are actually much bigger and much more diverse than anything that was set forth in the ancient world with regard to Republican forms of government. So Madison doesn't make that argument as much as he makes the argument that diversity itself is a benefit as opposed to a big problem. Anyway, the thing that Madison says his greatest innovation is to argue that if you grant liberty, you end up with diversity, and that diversity itself can provide stability and can provide a better kind of foundation for stability in the large republic than the superficial hope that you're going to actually achieve a homogeneity of interest in a small republic. He says that you're not going to do that. Anyway, Madison really is challenging several aspects of the small republic thesis. Republics in the ancient world were democracies in which people met in person, in which the whole population of citizens, which was not, of course, the whole population of inhabitants, but the whole population of citizens would meet in assemblies to decide questions. This is Athenian democracy, at least. And Madison differentiates a republic from a democracy, but these ancient republics were democracies, okay? It's direct democracies, what he calls pure democracies. And he's talking about republics now as based upon the principle of representation, which was really not known in the ancient world or deployed in republics in the way that it's going to be in the United States and then in all subsequent republics in world history. So anyway, he challenges that. He argues against, again, standard Republican theory that it's wrong or impossible to try to cure the mischiefs of faction by removing their causes. Remember, he's going to control their effects. And most importantly, he argues that a large republic with a multiplicity of religious sects and interest will be more stable and more just in its administration than a small republic. What that comes down to is the numerous interests in the extended republic are going to check and balance each other and provide that stability. So again, that's sort of the core point. Now, I can back up here and then go through the argument pretty much as it appears in the 10th Federalist paper. There are a few variations here, but I'll talk about a number of different things and then just sort of provide the details of Madison's argument. So he starts out talking about how Republican governments face the problem of faction. He uses the phrase as the diseases most incident to Republican government. What are those diseases? They're the diseases caused by the problem of faction. And Americans have experienced these problems in their state governments, And they've also, and these problems have appeared throughout the history of Republican governments, and we have this narrative. He then defines a faction, and that is an interesting part of this. His definition of a faction is pretty much consistent with ancient understandings of factions. He says, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole. And of course, he's going to focus on the majority. That is going to be the most threatening form of factionalism because the majority can get its way using the forms of the Constitution. The majority faction can use the Constitution to create a tyrannical act. Okay. And so Republican governments operate off the principle of majority rule. Majority factions can rule under the forms of the Constitution, but they can rule in their own favor and they can violate people's rights. He's worried about what we call majority tyranny, democratic despotism, a phenomenon that that de Tocqueville and also John Stuart Mill are going to fast onto really firmly in their thing. So anyway, he says factions, a number of citizens, majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest. And so united and actuated just means brought together and made active, charged, or brought together and activated would be another way of saying this, by passions or interest. And these are adverse to the rights of other citizens and the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. So factions are opposed to the rights of people and the permanent and aggregate or the common interest. So that definition of factionalism is pretty much in line with how factions been understood for a long time. Anyway, Madison then gives a typology of faction. So we know that factions are going to take place as either majorities or minorities, and we have to worry about majorities more. But also, how are they going to form? What types of factions are we going to get? Later in the analysis, he says that we're going to have factions concerning opinions, passions, and interests. Okay? And opinions are those concerning government and religion. So he's talking there about ideology and faith and how religion can become politicized. We know that, of course, in America. And people can disagree with each other and divide into these groups opposing each other based upon their political ideologies as well. Passions, he says, are expressed as an attachment to different rulers. So this is an old-fashioned understanding of faction as a faction is the followers, it's constituted by the followers of a certain leader. So the Trump faction, the Obama faction, the Clinton faction, you might think of those kinds of, these are the group of people who follow a particular leader, and they're going to be in conflict with people who follow a different leader. And then finally, he calls interest or property the most constant and durable source of faction. This is a really important point and something that AP graders actually look for too when they talk about this kind of thing. So it's he's saying that we're going to have most of our conflict most of the time over economic interest, more than we are even over passions or ideology, passions for different rules or ideologies. We're going to have economic conflict. And he does recognize in there, incidentally, interest group conflict, the differences, the kinds of conflicts that people have as a result of being a member of one interest group versus another interest group. And incidentally, I should have said this earlier, faction is most analogous to interest groups today. Sometimes students want to make factions analogous to political parties. They're more like, what he's talking about is more like what we call interest groups. Anyway, these kinds of conflict can be conflicts between interest groups, but they can also be class conflicts. They can be conflicts between people who have property and people who do not have property, or rich versus poor, or that kind of thing. So anyway, you got this problem of faction, then you got a definition of faction, then you got this typology of faction, and then he makes this famous division, and he says there are two methods of curing the mischief of faction. You can either try to remove the causes or control the effects. And you can remove the causes by destroying liberty. Obviously, you don't want to go that direction. That's unwise. He says it's a cure worse than the disease. And he sets up almost this kind he sets up this direct analogy, and he says faction is to liberty as air is to fire. Okay, so if you grant liberty, you're going to end up with faction, and air is also necessary to have fires. And fire is good and it nourishes, but fire is also it's also bad in some ways. Anyway, he says it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it is to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. So that's one way to remove the causes, and he doesn't want that. And the other way is to give to all the citizens the same opinions, passions, of interest. He calls this impracticable. And like I said earlier, though, this is the strategy that most Republican theorists have had up until this time period about how to deal with the problem of faction. Many of them have said that you have to try to use things like religious belief or a common education or civic education, or also even rules about the distribution of property in a particular place to prevent there from being all this factionalism. You try to give to everyone the same opinions, passions, and interests. He calls that impractical. He doesn't believe there's been an experiment in it that has worked. This is all that method, incidentally, is kind of caricatured in Plato's Republic, where he talks about the communism of the guardian class and how they're not going to have any property, and also the establishment of certain kinds of beliefs that reach across and unify people. So Madison says he's experimented, thought about these two ways of removing the causes. He says we're going to have to control the effects. We're going to grant liberty. We're going to end up with factions and factionalism, and we're still going to have to try to control the effects of these factions. But the effects of all factions are not the same. The effects of majority factions are much more consequential, more destructive than the effects of minority factions. So minority factions the political system can handle them. They can be outvoted in the normal processes of government. But majority factions can, again, use the forms of government to effect their violence. Madison says what this means is that the ancient form of a republic, a pure democracy, has no remedy for majority factions. People meet in their assembly, they vote, they're right there with each other, they know each other's opinions, passions, and interests, and the majority coalesces and they abuse the rights of the minority. Madison then defines the problem as, and he calls this his great desiderata, and he describes the problem as reconciling majority rule with the protection of individual rights and the promotion of the public good, but, and here's the catch, without violating the form of Republican government. So we need a Republican remedy for a Republican problem of majority factionalism. He then essentially lays out two solutions to this. One of them, and the language in this is very convoluted in this part. It's the only part of the 10th Federalist Papers that's kind of really hard to read or obscure. Anyway, he says that you're going to, in effect, elect representatives from large geographical districts. You don't have to have as many representatives in a large republic in proportion to citizens as you do in a small republic. And so what that is going to do is you're going to create much larger geographic districts. Madison then argues that that's going to increase the probability for the election of the best representatives. You're going to get these wise guardians of the public good if you elect them from large geographical districts. He says that unworthy candidates will be less able to practice what he calls the vicious arts by which such elections are conducted. And the vicious arts is a term of craft from Shakespeare. It has to do with witchcraft, and so this is the idea of using rhetoric in effect to stir people up. This is he's saying you're going to get fewer demagogues if you elect people from large geographic districts. There are other reasons why large geographic districts are better for elections. One thing that happens is you have fewer people in the legislative branch itself, and that turns out you have to raise the number to a certain level to get a deliberative assembly. But if you go beyond that level, if you get too many people in there, actually the political system, he says in Federalist 52 and 58, operates with more of an oligarchic tendency. Fewer members actually participate in a really large legislative body than in a moderately sized one. And that's what he thinks is best for deliberation. And this is related to the number of representatives and how big the districts are as well. But he places the most emphasis, and this is where he's considered most innovative, in saying that the extended republic will reach out across a variety of interests in the nation and religious sects in the nation, and that will prevent majority factions from coalescing on principles other than justice and the public good. And that comes from Federalist number 51 when he reintroduces this idea. Anyway, if you have an extended republic, you're going to have a greater number of individuals, a greater distance between the people and their representatives, and you're going to have a greater variety of interest in religious sects in the nation. That's going to make it less probable that the majority knows it's a majority. You have to know that you're a majority to want to act upon that impulse. They're going to be less likely to know they're a majority. And then they're going to have these obstacles or barriers to acting in concert with each other. Okay. Now, I want to put a particular twist on this, and you can make up your own, to the students I'm speaking to, you can make up your own mind whether you put this in your advanced placement exam, because it may not fit with their template or their grading scheme and know how these things are done. But anyway, here's what's really going on in both of those arguments for expanded electoral districts and for extent of territory and diversity of interest. Both of them promote the impartial arbitration of factional disputes. So what Madison wants, and he talks about this early in the 10th Federalist paper, is there to be impartiality in the resolution of factional disputes. So you need a third party kind of decision about when these different groups go against each other. But you can't have a third party that's completely independent of the parties in a Republican form of government, because they elect the people who are the representatives. They can't be totally independent. So what you do is you elect them in a large republic from large districts. They turn out to be the kind of people who are better able to make impartial judgments in factional disputes. And you create a greater independence as a result of extended territory for them to be able to make those kinds of decisions. Madison also believes that, especially within the legislative body, that the diversity of interest will themselves moderate each other and that will move the resolution that comes out of legislative deliberations more in line with an impartial resolution of that dispute. So this solves the great desideratum. You have majority rule, but in an extended republic, it is moderate and impartial majority rule. And it prevents majority tyranny without precluding majority rule, if that makes sense. And so that's kind of the core of what he's doing there with that little addendum of, it's not exclusively my interpretation, but the interpretation I share of this document with several other people. Core points here to think about when you're studying for an advanced placement thing in this is that remember that Madison thinks that economic factions are the most constant and durable source of faction. You should definitely remember that the solution for the problem of the mischiefs of faction is found in controlling their effects, not trying to suppress them in any way, to either abolish liberty or to give to everyone the same opinions, passion. You're not going to remove the causes. You have to deal with the effects because we're a country that grants liberty first. And, those are the most important core points. And then the thesis of the whole paper is basically that it's a multiplicity of interest that will have a kind of elixir for the problem of majority factionalism. Madison, incidentally, had dealt with the problem of majority factionalism in disputes regarding religious freedom in the state of Virginia during this time period, and he had seen that the multiplicity of interest, the multiplicity of religious sects in Virginia had sort of gone, had been in conflict with each other to some degree, but their interactions had moderated the conflict between them. So once the established church was overthrown and all of these different religious sects were going to be treated on the same ground, then you could have a neutral or impartial relationship of the state to these different religious groups, and one majority would not be able to oppress the other religious sects in the state of Virginia. So that's my version of Federalist number 10.
Perfect. Dr. Gibson, that was amazing. And for our AP Gov friends, Brutus 1 and Federalist 10 are required documents. And if you are a teacher or a student studying for the test, a lot of what Dr. Gibson hit was under topic 1.3, government powers and individual rights. So thank you for that deep dive on Federalist 10. And for students listening too, as we were doing this, I actually had a copy of Federalist 10 up and was going through it with Dr. Gibson and understanding. I mean, I've read Federalist 10 as a teacher hundreds of times, but every time I read it, there's something different. So thank you so much for that. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.